Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the eastern section of the front line within Dvorichna, getting almost full control over the town, leaving just a small part remaining under Ukrainian control. Russians advanced southwest of Svetove, getting control over an additional town and pushing the Ukrainians out towards the next line of defense. Russians have also managed to advance south of Pokrovsk, west of Pokrovsk, and in between Pokrovsk and Kurakhivka, west of Kurakhivka, north of Velika Novosilka, and to the west of Velika Novosilka. Starting out in the direction of Dvorichna, the Russians have managed to gain control over the majority of Siverskyi district of the town, leaving only the last road west of Dvorichna remaining under Ukrainian control, and with this the Russians are likely to gain full control over Dvorichna within the next few days, which will lead to the Russians having a proper foothold across the Oskli River line and will allow the Russians to concentrate a lot more forces within it to then develop offensive operations around it, securing the highway from Dvorichna towards Kupiansk and in the northern directions. The Russians advanced southwest of Svetove in the direction of the town of Dvorichna, as well as remaining parts of Dvorichna. With this, the Russians have managed to gain control of an additional town and move onwards to the next one. The Russians also recently captured Nadia and are advancing west of Serhivka. With this, we see that the Russians are here looking to connect their forces in the eastern section along the Siverskyi River line with the forces near Stepi and Kupengi, getting control over the area in between the towns and pushing alongside the first line of defense of the Ukrainians east of Borova. The Russians are here expanding their foothold across the Siverskyi River line to gain control over the areas beyond the first line of defense, likely to connect that direction with Avdiivka as well from the southern direction, gaining control over the road between the towns by connecting their forces from these several directions, pushing towards it, alongside it. And this is to gain control over the entire area along the Siverskyi River line, to gain a large enough bridgehead across to concentrate larger forces, and then push down in the southern direction as well along Avdiivka, getting control over an additional larger area. This will allow the Russians to have such a significant presence across the Siverskyi River line that they'll be able to launch operations towards Borova in the north, Liman in the south, and Oskli in the west. Further south here in the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the southern parts of Lysivka south of the river line. This has allowed them to, following the operations to cut off Sukhny Yar from Lysivka, secure the southern bank of the river line, and now fighting is taking place in the northern parts of the town to gain control over the first line of defense south of Pokrovsk, control over the remaining parts of Lysivka, push onwards to Sukhny Yar, and connects the control from Novogradivka in the east to Shevchenko in the west. The Russians also fighting in the direction of Novokrainka and the fortified positions north of the town, where Russians looking to gain control over the railway area, connecting the area west of Shevchenko with Shevchenko itself, and gaining full control over the first line of defense south of Pokrovsk to then move on to the second line of defense, which is just outside the town itself. Russians also advancing northeast of Kotlina, where they are looking to gain control over the fortified positions, securing yet another forest line along the railways. At the same time, the Russians also fighting near Dashne from the southern flank and the eastern flank, attacking it from two separate directions. However, the Ukrainians have a lot of forces in the area and are attempting to break the Russian positions along the railway and the highway, pushing them away from it to reopen the road. However, so far the Russians have kept the initiative and are trying to gain full control over Dachne, the industrial area, and the first line of defense west of Pokrovsk. The Russians made several advances to the south of this. The Russians managed to gain control of the remaining parts of Novoandrivka and are now pushing towards Sribne in the west. The Russians also managed to gain control over some forest lines here to the southwest of Novochelysavetivka, where they're looking to push towards Sribne from the northern and eastern directions at the same time. With the positions in the south, it's likely they'll attack from the southern flank as well along the forest line to get control over Shribne from three different directions, similar to how they fought over Novandrivka, and then push towards the next towns here in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to advance west of Slovianka, securing the pocket here in between their forces to the north and to the south, while looking to gain full control over the highway from Yasinova towards Andrivka. At the same time, they managed to push further, securing their positions along the northern flank of Andrivka to gain full control over the fortified positions in the area, the forest lines along the highway, Getting control of the highway as well will allow the Russians to launch a much stronger offensive operation from the northern flank of Avdiivka and push alongside the fortified positions, getting control over the remaining parts of it, while fighting also continues within the town itself. The Ukrainians remain with positions along the fortified positions in the eastern outskirts and throughout Avdiivka, where they're looking to hold out as long as possible and slow down the Russian forces as much as possible, but there is no coordinated counterattack by the Ukrainian forces, which means that the Russians have the full initiative over the fighting near Avdiivka. The Russians also managed to advance here west of Kurakhivka in the direction of Dachne, both to the south where they're fighting over the remaining fortified positions. South of Dachne, they also managed to gain control over parts of the eastern and southern parts of Dachne and expanded their foothold in the northern part of Dachne as they look to gain full control over the town. The Ukrainians are being forced back towards the western outskirts of it, following which that there is a large gap between the outskirts of Dachne with the fortified positions to which they can withdraw to. This means that the Ukrainian forces will not be able to withdraw from Dachne unless they are going out into the open fields. There's hardly any forest lines or anything else for them to take cover within, and therefore the Ukrainians will likely make a last stand within Dachne, the forces that remain, because their likelihood of them surviving a withdrawal is very low. And with the Russian attacks from the flanks, they'll be able to cut off the escape route within the next few days, and likely Dachne will fall soon as well, within the first week of February. The Russians are looking to gain full control over Dachne, then push onwards towards the fortified position by river crossing through the Dvorichna river line, and a push from the southern flank through the Sukhayeli river line towards Olekli, and that will allow the Russians to gain control over the southern flank of Avdiivka and fight towards Konstantinopel as well, where fighting is also taking place here on the western bank of the Sukhayeli river line. The way Kurakhivka will be used following their capture of the southern bank of the Dvorichna river line and the northern bank of the Sukhayeli river line is that the Russians will be able to concentrate their forces within Kurakhivka and have a good connection westwards to cross over the river lines and into Konstantinopel. Therefore, the main push will likely come from the Kurakhivka direction for further offensive operations. At the same time, it shortens the supply line towards Avdiivka and the northern bank of the Dvorichna river line, as well as the southern bank near Velika Novosilka. This will allow the Russians to have a stronger presence in the area between Yasenova in the north and Rostolne in the south, to push through in this direction from these separate axes of attack to gain full control over the area and then push onwards towards the western outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to advance northwest of Rostolne, gaining control over the fortified positions west of the village and pushing onwards towards Bahatir. According to the deep state map, the Russians managed to reach the second line of defense south of Bahatir. However, they have not been able to properly establish themselves alongside the road. But with this push, they managed to gain control over the fortified area west of Rostolne and are working to clear a gap in the Dragon Teeth and Anti-Tank Ditch defensive lines that are north of Rostolne for a push towards Bahatir from the south. Together with the fighting along the southern flank of Rusliv, the Russians will be moving onwards to gain control over the village area, a village agglomeration, the defensive line west of Kurakhivka, before moving onwards towards the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. This means the Russians will be prioritizing this area right here over the remaining parts of the Donetsk region in southwestern outskirts, where the Russians will be fighting west of Velika Novosilka towards the fortified areas and onwards towards the next line of defense and the final line of defense of the Ukrainians in the southwestern outskirts. The Russians managed to advance west of Remivka, securing the road from Remivka towards Novosilka, and the Russians will now begin offensive operations towards Novosilka in the west, across the river line towards Novocheretovaze, and the fortified positions through the flank and weak spot. This allowed the Russians to fight over the remaining fortified positions north of Velika Novosilka, gain control over the area, and then move alongside the Mokry-Yali river line here on the western bank and the eastern bank at the same time to gain control over the river line and the towns alongside it. There is a second line of defense north of Velika Novosilka, which includes anti-tank ditches, dragon teeth, and several firing positions, which makes it difficult for the Russians to push through such a line of defense. This is why their focus will be the area west of Kurakhivka. Gaining control over this area will allow the Russians to completely bypass this defensive line and attack it from the flank, to gain control over Kumar, and then flank it from the northern direction, which will leave it completely exposed. And this will allow the Russians to gain a significant advantage in fighting over this line of defense and gain control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Therefore, heavy fighting will continue along the southwestern region of the Donetsk region, where the Russians will look to gain control over this entire area, and fighting is taking place to achieve that. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.